Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to Maritime Matters. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. We're recording on the 14th of July. As ever, if anything radical happens, which seems to be happening currently as we speak, but if anything huge happens, that's why we haven't touched upon it. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack what's been happening in the past couple of weeks in the maritime domain, primarily in the Indo-Pacific, but occasionally we get dragged out a little bit more broadly. But we try and talk through what's been going on in the region and what's been going on in terms of capability. So let's dive in. Hi, Jen. How's it going?
I'm good, Richard. Lots happening. Once again, demonstrating that, I guess, maritime matters. And as you mentioned, we are going to try and talk a little bit more about our closely defined region today. So we won't be delving into the US naval blockade on Iran that starts in a couple of hours, or President Trump's claims to charge money for ships going through the strait, which in my view is just bluster. We won't be delving into that. And in fact, there's been some significant developments as well around the Black Sea with Ukrainian attacks on Russian shadow tankers. So lots happening. And in fact, US one-way attack uncrewed surface vessels to attack a port in Iran. But we're not going to be delving into any of that. Richard, what have you been up to recently?
So the main thing I've been doing has been trying to get the survey. I mentioned it last podcast that we were running a survey, and as ever, it's taken me longer to get it over the line than I had hoped, but it's out today. So if you're interested in what the public thinks about the Australian Defence Force, take a look. We'll probably tag a link into the show notes. What about you?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, certainly the renewed conflict in the Middle East has been taking up a significant amount of my time. I've also been traveling. I've actually been lucky enough to be in the Philippines working with the Philippines Coast Guard on techniques around strategic analysis. And working on a piece that I'm hoping will come out with Lowy around October, November, which is conceptualizing the idea of self-reliance within the alliance, but trying to use Richard Hill. So Admiral Richard Hill wrote a great book on medium power maritime strategy that I had to reborrow from Richard today. I need to buy a copy of this. In the 80s, talking about how medium maritime powers should think about maritime strategy. And a subset of that is how they should think about their relationship with alliances. So I'm writing this piece for Lowy. It's much broader than just maritime, but anchoring it in Richard Hill's concept about the relationship of medium powers within alliances with a much larger alliance partner. So that is taking up a lot of my time. But Richard, what's been happening in the region when it comes to maritime?
So there's been quite an interesting announcement in the Australian-Indian relationship. Part of it's been a wider announcement. I think this was about a week ago now. The Australia-India Joint Declaration on Defence and Security Cooperation, in which kind of unpacks a number of different levels of this relationship. Now, as I think most of our listeners will know, the Australian-Indian relationship, defence relationship, is something that has been burgeoning over recent years. And despite there've been issues and concerns, particularly around the Quad and the relationship within that, Australia-India relations have remained very strong. And so this announcement of a kind of furthering the comprehensive strategic partnership, which was announced a few years ago now, and it has some pretty strong maritime elements to it. Obviously, a strong focus on the Indo-Pacific, but they've agreed to do things like increase the complexity of defence exercises. So things like exercise Malabar is obviously one of the ones that we talk about quite regularly. But the Indians and Royal Australian Navy have also been engaged in a number of other exercises, including they were doing some anti-submarine warfare exercises, I think, late last year. But other things, so expanding aircraft deployments from each other's territories. One of the other areas where we've seen quite a lot of engagement has been around the P8s, because India operates P8s and Australia operates P8s. And then there's an agreement to strengthen maritime cooperation through something that's described as the India-Australia Maritime Security Collaboration Roadmap. Now, I'm not sure if you've seen much about this.
I have not seen much about this.
No. But there is a roadmap.
Maritime security, I suggest.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll have something on increasing maritime domain awareness, because every single roadmap always does. But there's been a lot of announcements, a lot of discussion. Quite what the detail is, I'm not really sure. There was also something around connections between Maritime Border Command and the Indian Coast Guard, which again I think is quite interesting, particularly given the kind of the role of white hulls and how that on that level of kind of both actual maritime security and maritime security as kind of strategic statecraft. I think there's some interesting things playing out there. So interesting development. Still not quite sure exactly what it is and whether it's a lot of announcements and not a lot of action, but we'll see. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, look, I noted that the last time we signed a joint declaration on security cooperation was with India was in 2009. So this looks like an update to that. And of course, since 2009, we have become comprehensive strategic partners. That was signed in 2020 during COVID. In terms of the top line points that have been pushed out about this, I mean, it's all positive. You couldn't disagree with any of that. India is an incredibly important partner, specifically when it comes to the Indian Ocean. And yes, we should be enhancing defence cooperation, but I couldn't really see anything in it that looked new. They look like kind of similar themes that we've been talking about with India for a while. I was disappointed by the way, when you mentioned the bilateral exercise between India and Australia, the naval exercise, that you didn't mention the name, and only because I'm going to take credit for giving it the name. It's called AusIndex. I was the lead planner for AusIndex, the inaugural AusIndex. And I won't go into the details of what the defence attaché in India, Australian defence attaché in India, wanted to call it at the time, but it was certainly not a name as good as AusIndex, and I went into battle. So you're welcome is called AusIndex, which is also a boring name, but that's what exercise names should be, unlike Exercise Maritime Big Play, which I'm going to reiterate is the worst naval exercise name I've ever heard of. Good exercise, worst name.
Will we ever have a podcast where we don't talk about Maritime Big Play and you rant about its name?
No, we won't. When it was first named, I actually gave an ABC interview with Greg Jenner, where he actually said it's the worst name in the world. And somebody clipped that and sent it to the person who invented the name for that, whom I know and is a good friend. Anyway, look, back onto this. India is an important maritime security partner, so pleasing to see this kind of front and centre of Prime Minister Modi's visit last week to Australia. Exactly what it all means, though, is honestly hard to say. And I think we'll see in time if the exercises, whether it is Malabar, whether it is AusIndex, whether it is the Army exercises we've been doing with India, or the Air Force exercises, a lot of work in the P8 space, whether those do become more complex or not, I think will be the telling story.
Yeah. So what else has been happening in the region?
Well, look, lots, but we did say we're going to combine it to this region. So we can't really talk about what's been happening in this region without talking about a certain country firing a submarine launch ballistic missile on Monday, the 6th of July, and the craziness that then ensued within Australia. It is significant, don't get me wrong. I think it is significant. We should pay attention. I do not believe that the People's Liberation Army Navy timed their long-range ballistic missile launch that requires significant degrees of preparation, let alone getting a JL2, most likely, or potentially JL3. I'll get into the differences between both, with a dummy warhead to sea on a submarine, getting all of their tracking vessels in place in the Pacific, just to coincide with Prime Minister Albanese's visit to Fiji. it is unlikely. Now, with one caveat, which is if it was actually scheduled the day before or the day after, they may have moved it 24 hours. But my point is, there is so much planning that goes into a long-range ballistic missile firing that I would say that the timing was more coincidental. And in many ways, I think for China, counterproductive, given that they fired it on the day Australia signed a treaty with Fiji called the Ocean of Peace Defence Treaty. And in fact, what we saw after the firing, we saw a number of Pacific countries come out and critique China, which is actually probably the most significant amount of criticism we've seen of China's military actions in the region from Pacific countries who don't normally lean into that conversation. Now, what actually happened? There is a lot of debate about what has actually happened, and it's kind of hard to determine the facts. My take is most likely a Chinese submarine operating in the South China Sea fired a JL-2 that skirted around the northern part of the Philippines, didn't overfly Japan or the Philippines, it looks like. Traveled potentially about 6,000-7,000 kilometers or so, and landed in between Nauru and Tonga. In terms of the concern about it, look, one of the concerns the Australian government raised, which I think is completely valid, is the limited notice. So it looks like the Chinese embassy in Australia gave Australia about 2 to 3 hours notice and similar notice to the rest of the region, which I think is concerning. Also, a lot of people have made the point that, in fact, China's press release made the point that this is routine. And a lot of people have made the point that nuclear powers do long-range ballistic missile firing tests, which is true. And the US fires about 2 to 3 Minuteman ballistic missiles a year into their range in the Marshall Islands. I think the difference with this, though, is it's not routine when you've done 3 in 44 years. So it is a change in posture. I mentioned that I said it wasn't clear whether it's a JL-2 or a JL-3. What is the difference? JL-2 is really China's first long-range submarine-launched ballistic missile. Before that, they operated the JL-1, which is range about 2,000-3,000 kilometers-ish. 2015, we saw the JL-2 come out, which has a range of about 8,000 kilometers-ish. We did actually see in 2022 test firings of the JL-3. Now, the JL-3 has an estimated range of 10,000 kilometers plus. It's significant because 10,000 kilometers plus allows China to target the continental US with a second strike capability from the South China Sea, from China's preferred bastion operating area of the People's Liberation Army Navy nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines. We first saw the physical picture of that actually at China's military parade last year in September. What's your take on the submarine-launched ballistic missile firing?
So I was a little, not disappointed, but surprised. Well, again, not surprised, but I guess, yeah, slightly disappointed in the amount of kind of hot takes around this. Yes, it is unusual for China to do this. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it was the first submarine launched ballistic missile test since 1980. But they've tested their land capabilities more recently.
Yes, September 24.
So it's unusual. Is it unusual for nuclear powers that operate ballistic missile submarines to test their missiles in this kind of way? No, it's not. The American boats do it, and certainly the UK boats do it post significant refit. So I don't know if our listeners will remember, but probably 2 years ago now, one of the UK Trident boats conducted a test in the US range in the Atlantic, which didn't go very well. And of course, that was the story. There wasn't the fact that a test happened. The story was the fact that it didn't go very well. So I think there are questions here about the degree to which we are being slightly hypocritical. Nobody would pay huge attention. The French do this regularly. Nobody pays huge attention to the French or the Americans doing this. The Chinese do it. All of a sudden, it's a big story. Now, I think there are realistic issues around notice and that kind of thing. again, I think in some ways there's certain parallels to the live fire exercises as part of the Chinese task force. The fact they did it isn't necessarily a problem. Do they do it in the right kind of way? Do they provide people with the right kind of notice? That is a potential angle which I think you can raise some more legitimate kind of concerns. The thing that I was most surprised about is that it is so patently, obviously, the Chinese shooting themselves in the foot to fire this into the Pacific. Quite why, when they invest huge amounts of money in trying to generate goodwill in this area through aid, where they're trying to build these kind of diplomatic networks, etc., and then they go and do something like this, and you're like, why? Why would you do that? It is entirely beyond me. And I think it does, once again, it highlights that for all we often talk about China as being this supremely organized, deeply integrated planning organization where everyone knows exactly what they're going to do as part of this mission to take over the world or whatever, retake Taiwan in 2027, whatever it is you want to frame it around. I think that in many ways, in exactly the same way that the Soviet Union was an organization which on the outside as it looks like a monolith, but inside there's lots of different people all doing things, often doing things that are counterproductive to each other. I think the same is absolutely true of China. And I suspect that the Chinese are going to pay diplomatically in many ways for this test for some time to come in the region.
Yeah, I agree, and I pretty much agree with your entire take. I do think that things can be a test firing and standard, but also a demonstration of capability in sending a message. I think that things can be more than one category at once, and there's no way the planners for this didn't think about exactly where it's going to land and the message. There are other places much further away from other countries where you could do this, and so I think that there is something in that in terms of just a reminder of China's capability, which is, military coercion, which is, many countries, including Australia, undertake military coercion. And so I think that is interesting. But more broadly, I think that the response to it just, again, kind of reiterates how, and this is easy to say, harder to do, right? But how we're probably not having the right level of conversation about how much this region is changing and what that means for Australia. I think that we probably haven't reached the right tone. I mean, when you think about Australian politics right now, like the world is rapidly changing around us, but it's difficult to hear a politician talk about anything that isn't domestically focused, to be honest, until something like this happens. And then there's all these kind of, perhaps over-the-top responses. The most over-the-top, I won't name the politician, they're not in either of the major parties, but a politician who the following day, if you are in Australia, you're tracking this. If you're not Australian, you're not tracking this. We had a major outage of one of our telecommunications companies, and a non-responsible or knowledgeable politician made a statement that perhaps this is linked to China's ballistic missile firing, which is just absolutely ludicrous. So I think that a better conversation, more discussion around this probably would result in a greater understanding.
Yeah. And I think we'll have to get there because it's not like China is not building more submarines and not planning on having greater capability in this kind of area. All the indicators that we have are that this is going to probably become more common. And I think it is time for Australia to realise that, yes, there are very significant challenges posed by China, but no matter whether we like it or not, China is going to become a major power, already is a major power in our region, and is going to act like a major power. But yeah. Anyway.
Right. Speaking of China, segue.
Absolutely. So
10th anniversary.
10th anniversary 2 days ago of the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal on the South China Sea, which feels shocking. How can it be 10 years?
Do you know, I was thinking that. I was like, wow, is it 10 years? And then I thought about where I was. And I wonder where you were. Where were you when this was announced in 2016? What were you doing, Richard?
I was still in the UK.
Right.
So I wasn't even in Australia.
Wow. And now you have a tan. So your life is it's either tan or the lighting at UNSW. But either way, your life has completely changed.
Absolutely. Anyway.
I was doing, randomly, I was doing legal work experience. So I wasn't a lawyer in the Navy. I was a warfare officer, but I did get admitted to the ACT Supreme Court as a lawyer. I was doing legal work experience in the Chief of Navy's office at the time, and remember going to workshops about what this wonderful arbitral tribunal decision meant, and listening to experts about how this was fundamentally going to change what is happening on the ground in the South China Sea. And it is a significant decision, but 10 years on, I think we can say it has not changed what is happening on the ground in the South China Sea.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. But anyway, we'll come back to this. So it was a claim that was initially lodged by the Philippines under the kind of as part of the framework of UNCLOS. And I don't know why I'm doing this bit and you're not, because you know far more about this than I do. But there is a tribunal kind of mechanism for claimants where states can't agree over something to take it to an arbitral tribunal. And the Philippine government did this in, I think, 2013.
2013.
And then there was a long-running kind of case involving very distinguished set of international lawyers, etc. And eventually they handed down their ruling 10 years ago. And this has effectively stated that China's claims within the South China Sea to large parts of the Philippine EEZ are groundless. And it does so on a number of different elements by kind of being more precise in some of the definitions, and particularly things like around what is an island and a whole host of other things. But I guess the reason why this has come up is it has been the 10-year anniversary was flagged by a large number of states, which issued a kind of a joint statement which reaffirmed the tribunal's decision and kind of once again reinforces that these states, which include Australia, Canada, Germany, New Zealand, Philippines, Slovenia, UK, US, amongst others. I don't know why I included Slovenia in there, but they're in the list. But that they are continue to believe in the importance of upholding freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, and other things. Now, of course, the slight irony of the US doing that 2 days ago and then the claims being made elsewhere. We're going to park that particular one. But it is, and coming back to why I slightly push back on you, has it changed what's happening on the water? No. Has it been an incredibly useful weapon to build, or a tool with which to build much wider international support for the Philippines? Yes. Right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And
You're right.
The mere fact that all of these states signed this and made a point about this 10 years on highlights the impact that this has had. So I think it is an excellent example of kind of small state lawfare. But China is currently willing to wear the reputational damage that goes along with that. And in that, it also highlights the limitations of small state lawfare.
Yeah, look, I think they're all good points, and I agree with you. I wasn't trying to diminish the significance. I think it is significant, and I think certainly beneficial. I mean, it's there are a number of elements of it, as you mentioned, in terms of definitions of rocks and islands and what maritime zones they're entitled to, etc. But the most significant thing, of course, is the invalidation of China's claims, the Nine Dash Line, whether they are in fact historical or not. It says that UNCLOS supersedes them. So I think that's all important. I was probably more reflecting on, I guess, the optimism when it landed, as opposed to its usefulness. And we've got to remember too that at the time between 2013 and 2016, there was a significant political change in the Philippines. President Duterte was elected. I can't remember exactly when. I'm going to say 2015, but if you're an expert in Philippine politics and I got that wrong, I apologize. But he was much closer to China than the now President Marcos Jr. Is. And so actually for the first few years of this, the Philippines really didn't make much of it. In fact, there wasn't a lot of fanfare around it. It's only really become really pushed in the narrative by the Philippines in kind of recent years under the Marcos administration. But no, I agree. I agree with you, Richard. We've got to find something to disagree on. We probably will later on. I'm not sure. There's not much controversial we're talking about today, to be honest.
No, not so much. We're parking all the controversial things.
We are, because we need to focus on our region. Speaking of, though, the Nine Dash Line, I guess something else I wanted to flag, not only the 10th anniversary of the Arbitral Tribunal, but also something, it hasn't happened in the last couple of weeks, but we haven't really talked about on this show yet, which is China's reinvigoration of island building at Antelope Reef, which is fascinating. The reason I think it's fascinating is it's not super clear to me what the strategic significance of Antelope Reef is. So, where is Antelope Reef? First, Antelope Reef is 216 nautical miles to the east of Da Nang in Vietnam. It is just inside Vietnam's EEZ, but it is a high tide elevation. So it is potentially an island or rock, depending on how you want to get into that argument, as opposed to a low tide elevation, which a low tide elevation in other countries' EEZ, this is boring, but this is part of the Arbitral Tribunal, does belong to that country. If it's a high tide elevation, then there are discussions around who has sovereignty over it, which is something that's beyond UNCLOS. So it sits in the Paracel Islands. It's kind of the westernmost part of the Paracel Islands. But what is significant about it is, so we know that China had a huge island building campaign from kind of 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. But this is the most significant, or the first significant artificial island building that China has undertaken in the South China Sea since 2017. Now, China is not the only country that does artificial island building in the South China Sea. The Philippines has done some, Vietnam has done, and is doing more. But China's is by far the most significant in terms of the amount of island building. In the last 6 months, Antelope Reef has been built up by about 2.3 square miles. It's now a crescent of gleaming sand with a deep water internal bit where a significant amount of ships could be placed. But also it looks like they are creating another long range or another significant military airfield. Now, there's been some questions about why would they do that? Because Woody Island is close by. Woody Island has significant military capability and a lengthy airfield. But I just think this is interesting. One, that China is returning to island building at scale, this time in the Paracels. And two, that they're looking at, or it looks like they're building it to put military installations on it. And it's not quite clear to me what the strategy is there. Some have suggested that actually it's more about intimidating Vietnam in response to Vietnam's island building, which maybe is an expensive way to do that. But I just wanted to flag Antelope Reef. Richard, any thoughts, takes?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. One of the things that I do think is really interesting is, and I would kind of, I guess, slightly nuance what you were saying there. Vietnam's actually undertaken quite a lot of this recently. And in many ways, well, in certain respects, Vietnam was one of the first to be doing this kind of thing with their original DK platforms, which are like kind of mini oil rigs that they stuck on on many of these contested features in the 1980s. So Vietnam definitely has kind of form in this notion of sort of territorializing large sort of maritime spaces. And so I think it's really interesting to see Vietnam and China both sort of playing the same kind of game in this region, which I mean, obviously, we would argue that Vietnam, most of the time, although not all of the time, depending on where these islands are, or these features are, has rights to do this. Some of them are outside of their EEZ, and therefore there's all sorts of questions there. But I think it's really interesting in terms of kind of from a maritime strategic perspective, the idea of permanently putting structures in the middle of the sea in order to assert sovereignty or assert control is something that's basically an anathema. But it is something that's playing out in this kind of region. So I think it is a really interesting one. In terms of the location, it does appear that this is very much a Vietnam-focused project. But I agree with you in terms of quite how it fits into the sort of more military style strategy for the South China Sea. I'm not entirely sure. So I guess it's one that's worth waiting to see. And certainly again, why have they started this in 2026, having parked it 9 years ago and got significant capability already in the area? So yeah, lots of questions, but it is certainly something to keep an eye on.
Now, one of the justifications actually just reminds me that I did read that I'm not sure on this, but I thought it was interesting. Certainly, the significant military bases China has built up. Really, we're thinking Fiery Cross Reef, we're thinking Mischief Reef, we're thinking Woody Island. Fiery Cross Reef and Mischief Reef being in the Spratlys, many people have said for a very long time, yes, they're significant for control of the South China Sea. It is what allows China to project its coast guard so far into the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. But in the event of a conflict, they would be incredibly vulnerable. And some have argued quite easily destroyed or rendered ineffective. I did see somebody write in the last week when I was reading about Antelope Reef that potentially focusing on the paracels provides a bit more strategic depth. I'm not convinced on the argument, but I thought that was an interesting interesting take on it. The expectation that China that they would probably lose Mischief Reef or Fiery Cross Reef in the initial couple of days of a major conflict in the region, but the paracels would give a little bit more depth. So I'm not sure on that take, but I thought that was an interesting take.
Yeah. Certainly that's always been the narrative around the how vulnerable these islands are. But yeah, I guess if the more you have, the more likelihood, or the more you're complicating your enemy's job in trying to. Well, you're not going to destroy them, right? You're just trying to degrade them. So, yeah, interesting. Anyway.
Now, speaking of something that's probably even more interesting, and I think we're going to be in violent agreement on this one, I suspect, but maybe not. The Royal Navy's new defence investment plan. Sorry. The UK Armed Forces' new defence investment plan and the impact on the future force structure of the Royal Navy. What is your take on this?
So this comes out of a background of a pretty clear picture in which Britain is unable to marry up its interests and its desires in the kind of the defence space with the money it's willing to pay, and it ultimately it has champagne taste on beer money, and is been across basically since 2010 pretty much. It has been attempting to eke out its defense capability and cutting corners wherever possible. And you've seen it through things like the RN surface fleet and how long delayed everything has been there. And supposedly things are progressing there, and the Type 26s should be coming on stream soon, the Type 31s. Similarly, in the submarine space as well, things like the lack of investment in infrastructure for maintenance, which has seen that the UK submarine fleet decimated in terms of its availability. Now, this has kind of reached basically crisis point. There's not enough money. And so seemingly the solution is that the Royal Navy is currently now betting the house on a bunch of autonomous capabilities that nobody really knows whether they exist or whether they work. Most notably within this, they have abandoned the Type 83, which was the supposed follow-on air warfare destroyer to the Type 45. Originally, the Type 83, building on, I think, the original Type 82, which was the supposed big air warfare destroyer that was supposed to protect the carrier, the previous generation of big carriers. And then the Type 83 was supposed to be a super advanced, super modern, very large air warfare platform. And that has now been binned and is supposedly being replaced by 6, I think, is the narrative at the moment, what are referred to as common combat vessels. Now, quite what these things are, nobody really seems to know.
I don't think the UK knows.
No. There are some fancy graphics. A lot of it plays off a kind of a thought bubble that was thrown out by Babcock a little while ago. But these are effectively kind of motherships so a crewed mothership hub, and then you would have spokes of a number of uncrewed surface vessels. A Type 91, which is effectively being a missile barge, an arsenal ship type thing. So a way of getting a large number of VLS cells to sea. In many ways, a very similar concept to what was the US LUSV or the Australian LOSV, both of which have very quietly died a death.
Well, no, the LOSV, I was surprised to say, was still mentioned in the National Defence Strategy 26. Still mentioned.
But how?
I don't know.
When exactly are we planning on building?
You don't have to have a plan. You just need to write it into the strategy. It's all about deterrence. Sorry,
yeah,
keep going.
So there's a Type 91, which is kind of a missile barge, air warfare, obviously focused. And then there's talk about a Type 92, which is more of an ASW platform. Now, it fits obviously in with the First Sea Lord's broader hybrid, though quite how hybrid it is, considering how few crewed assets they seem to have at the moment, fleet approach, and obviously the Atlantic Bastion concept, which is the current way in which they're trying to cover for the fact they don't have enough astutes or Type 23s to actually do ASW in the North Atlantic in the way that they should be. So in my take, this is a deeply depressing and almost certain to fail
Grim
concept. But I'm going to be proved wrong when the Royal Navy has a wonderful regeneration and leads the way in uncrewed platforms.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to be. And this is where, I keep trying to check myself sometimes on my assessments on the future of uncrewed surface vessels, because I don't want to be, that Luddite that just can't see the future. And I certainly see a role. And I mean, look, we said we weren't going to talk about it, but I'll just reflag. In the last 24 hours, we saw the US taking a leaf out of Ukraine's book and using one-way attack uncrewed surface vessels to attack what looks like, I think, a mini submarine and a port. I think it was around Vanderbilt. I'm not exactly sure on the details, but there is very clearly a role for uncrewed surface vessels and, in fact, uncrewed underwater vehicles. But I question the role that the Royal Navy are putting forward here. And I guess one of the things that I was first, before I get into that, I just want to do a shout out. Actually, one of the articles I found the most informative on this is the Navy Lookout. So if you follow navylookout.com, they've written some great articles on this, and probably the best stuff I've seen in terms of detail about what the Royal Navy is thinking about its future hybrid fleet. I guess my first kind of alarming or red flag with this is when it was announced, and many of the commentators I've seen who are supportive of this concept have said this is taking the lessons from Ukraine and the Middle East and applying them to the future Royal Navy force structure. And I want to delve into this a little bit because there are a lot of effective lessons.
It'll make me cry.
Well, it was just and reiterated by people who I actually have, I respect their views, but I think they've just completely overlooked your talking. I mean, this is apples and oranges conversation. So, Ukraine have effectively, in a sea denial construct, used uncrewed surface vessels, predominantly with explosives in the front of them, like the US has in the last 24 hours, at significant ranges, certainly ranges of 450 nautical miles or further. Some examples of them also using surface-to-air missiles on them, although those examples of being effective in shooting down aircraft are pretty limited. But there is a role. Now, those boats are generally, and I'm generalizing, there is a whole range of boats that are covered under this, but, they're kind of remotely controlled 5 to 7 meters with explosives in the front of them, right? Not to diminish that. They are certainly an interesting capability, and there is a future role. The Royal Navy's vessels that they are talking about are predicted to be anywhere between 80 to 100 meters long, not 5 to 7 meters, and 2,000 to 3,000 tons. Now, just to orient you, Armidale class patrol boat. I don't actually think we have any of them before. I guess Cape class patrol boat. They're about 500 tons. An Arafura offshore patrol vessel is about 1,600 tons. So you're talking about an uncrewed vessel that is just a bit larger, or perhaps twice the size of an Arafura offshore patrol vessel, operating at a harsh environment. This is not close to the coast. This is going to have to be able to project power across the ocean, so at distance, with no daily maintenance to keep that vessel going, right? Issue number one. Two, then you're talking about the concept of embarking missiles on that vessel. Now, anyone who's ever served on a warship at sea would know that missile maintenance is the significant thing that gets greenies out of bed. Sorry if there's any greenies watching this. You do great work. But missile maintenance is intensive, right? So no maintenance occurring on those missiles for these things to be deployed and have endurance. And I do know that the US did release a thing to industry, asking industry to come up with, the UK industry to come up with a solution to be able to maintain missiles at sea for, I think it was 2 months or something like that, without maintenance. Highly unlikely. So there's some initial conceptual issues with this. The third element with this is, so one, that is not based off lessons in Ukraine, because in the Black Sea there are no 80 to 100 metre, 2,000 to 3,000 tonne uncrewed surface vessels operating at distance from the coast. So not based on that. The second issue that I have with it is the timeframes they're talking about. So I'm not saying that at some point in the distant future there won't be a large uncrewed surface vessel. I think it is unlikely for the kind of roles we're contemplating. For roles much closer to the coast, ferries, etc., those things are already being tested, and I see that there is a future there. Often the future involves, by the way, pilots being flown on to join the vessel to take it in and out of port. But the next issue I then see with them is, so the Type 45s, which is the UK's 6 destroyers, which are meant to decommission in 10 years from now, will be replaced by this concept. 6 common combat vessels, of which there is no design for, that can control this large, it's the Type 91 missile barge, the Type 92 sloop, which is effectively a large vessel with a large radar on it, and the Type 94 picket vessel, which is an ASW vessel. Able to do that in a denied communications environment, because what is one of the key lessons from Ukraine? One of the key lessons from Ukraine is electronic warfare and denied communications environments, and that this is all going to happen in 10 years. Now, in terms of their crewed fleet, at that point, they would have 6 common combat vessels. Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of the crewed fleet, so they would have 8 Type 26, 5 Type 31, so 13 frigates, 6 common combat vessels, so 19 crewed vessels supported by all of these other, and the numbers, etc., of the other vessels aren't available. So short of conflict, what is one of the major roles of ships is constabulary operations. It is maritime enforcement, those kind of roles, whether you're doing counter-piracy, etc. Of course, the uncrewed vessels have no ability to do that. I think my third major issue with it is the perception that this is somehow going to save on costs. Look, it is unfair to compare the Zumwalt destroyer to what the UK are proposing. But I think the lesson from the Zumwalt is a not well understood design that's going to have new technology that nobody quite has yet is very difficult to actually cost. So the idea that these are going to be, so this experimental design that doesn't exist based on experimental capabilities that don't exist is going to somehow be cheaper than a Type 31 frigate, I think is actually probably unlikely. So, look, I have a number of concerns with this, and I think, I actually genuinely want to be proven wrong. Like, I want us to do this podcast in 10 years and be like, wow, look at that amazing Royal Navy fleet. But I just think it is highly unlikely. And I think that there is a difference here between the PR spin put around it and the fact that what we actually see is a UK who doesn't want to invest in naval capability, but still wants the security effect and the prestige of having a navy.
Yep. As somebody
we agree
who's
too
written,
much
about some of these challenges, particularly the challenges around using uncrewed platforms in peacetime and for across the span of maritime tasks, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, even down to the reality of operating in the North Atlantic, right? I mean, you've spent time in the northern bits of the North Atlantic. It's not
being terribly seasick in the North Atlantic, yes. Claim to fame.
Not a hugely pleasant place to be, and certainly not a place where you put systems and expect them to stay there for long periods of time without maintenance and other things. And then the idea of this doing ASW, right? I mean, again, the notion that you're taking something from Ukraine, which is basically a glorified fire ship, and then you're saying, oh, well, this proves we can do ASW against Russian submarines in the North Atlantic, which is arguably one of the most technologically advanced and difficult things a modern military can do. You're not even talking apples and oranges. You're talking apples and cheese. Or I don't know. I'm making stuff up now, but you know what I mean.
Apples and cheese. That'll take off.
Let's move on and talk about something a bit more positive.
Yes. Good news.
Yeah. Do you want to crack on with this one?
Absolutely. So I was pleasantly surprised to see this. About 2 days after China fired a sub-launch ballistic missile into the Pacific last week, we saw a release from the Department of Defense, which indicated that in June they had undertaken a trial of a medium-range ballistic missile system, effectively. Now, this system, pretty interesting, because a lot of people have been saying for a long time, Australia should just go and buy Patriots. Like, there's all of these Patriots available to purchase, which we know there isn't. And we actually saw, tangential, but we saw at the NATO conference last week, the US make arrangements for Patriots to be able to be built in some European countries. But anyway, back to this. This is an interesting concept. So a CEA radar. So we know the CEA radar is, I think it's partly owned now by the Australian government. It is the radar that is on the Anzac class frigates. By all accounts, a really effective radar system, being teamed with a virtual Aegis system supplied by the US and a Royal Australian Navy SM2 to conduct test firings as part of the medium range anti-ballistic missile or interceptor capability that the ADF is going to embark on. Now, this was quite a surprise to everyone. So I think this is positive. Now, in terms of how successful these firings were or when this capability might be rolled out or scale, etc., nobody knows. In the Integrated Investment Program released in April this year, it was notable that money taken out in the 2024 Integrated Investment Program around medium-range ballistic missile defense was back. And so this is obviously funding this, one would assume. So we don't know timeframes, etc. But this, really interesting concept. Great to see an Australian radar used. SM2 missile. Unfortunately, we don't build those in Australia, which is a slight limitation. But yeah, good news story. Good news story. Obviously, released and not proactively, but released reactively in response to China's ballistic missile firing.
Yeah, absolutely. It is certainly a good news story. A lot of the chat around in the lead up to NDS 26 was around the weaknesses within Australian defence in terms of IAMD, right? Integrated Air and Missile Defence, and the fact that effectively Australia doesn't really have any significant capability in this area. And at least part of that was seen as being plugged through that the money that was going towards a kind of a medium level system. And everyone, certainly, I assumed that we would be at the back of the queue for Patriot missiles. That was certainly my kind of assumption. And so I think this is a great idea, really interesting. It does also raise some quite interesting other kind of questions about potentially, because if we look at a similar, at least from an outsider's perspective, a similar kind of setup in terms of the Typhoon or Typhoon system that the US Army in particular has used. I wonder whether or not there is potential for other missiles to be fired from a setup like this. I don't know whether or not that is the case, but it certainly raises some interesting possibilities. It does. It also, as you say, has the benefit of having a significant Australian involvement and cuts out the huge bottlenecks that currently exist in American-made air defense systems, both in terms of the platforms themselves or the systems themselves, but in particular, obviously the interceptors, whether that be Patriot or THAAD or whatever. We've seen that's been one of the key narratives coming out of the Middle East, and the movement of these systems, and then the use of interceptors. So anything that can avoid those kind of challenges and get capability online faster is obviously great.
It is. Now, just looking at time, we probably better wrap up soon. We won't get to talking about Canadian subs, but congrats to Canada. You're getting some new subs. That's great. One thing I do want to flag, though, is that the Australian Naval Institute has put out a call for papers for their Goldrick seminar. So their Goldrick seminar occurs annually. It's scheduled for November this year. You can go to their website and look at the call for papers, but they're accepting papers by the 15th of August. The details on the website. But if you want to submit a paper to speak at the Goldrick conference, the theme of the conference is maritime power and national resilience. And the sub-themes are protecting the maritime supply chain, critical maritime infrastructure, and undersea domain security. Topical, naval capability and force posture for a contested maritime environment, and strategic partnerships and governance of the maritime resilience. So, if you want to submit a paper, go to the ANI website and check that out.
Excellent. I think we're all out for time.
We are.
And so we simply have to, once again, as we do at the end of every episode, remind our listeners that maritime matters. Thank you for listening. And join us again soon.
Maritime does matter. Thanks, Richard.
Cheers.